Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to talk here today. I, unlike everyone else here, have never been to one of these conferences before, but I have been to a lot of conferences about older people and about dementia, and I do research at UCL in dementia, but also talk to people worldwide about it. So I'm going to talk about risk factors for dementia and what we should do. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that the work that I do and I'm talking about is international work with a very large number of different people contributing enormously to this. It's not just mine. And here's a list of them. And in particular, Andrew Summerlad, Naheed McAdam and Sergei Costafrida have done huge amounts, partly because they sit in the same floor as me in UCL and it's difficult to avoid when I ask them to keep doing things. And these are our sponsors. So I'm going to talk about why dementia matters and why we should consider it preventable, the risks, the things that might make a difference, and give you a life course model and talk about how it computes. I'm going to talk about what does it mean and the cost and benefit just in a little bit because I haven't got long, and what we should do. So why should you care? What does it matter? Well, dementia is not inevitable when reaching retirement age or even when reaching the ninth decade. Dementia is the 21st century greatest global challenge, and in particular in Japan, which is a super aging society. In Britain and many other countries, people ask people of 55 and over, what do they most fear? And dementia is the most feared disease. Currently, more than 55 million people have it worldwide. It's predicted to triple by 2050, and that's because people are living longer and fewer people are thankfully dying young. It occurs mainly in older people over 65, about 97, 98%. And it affects the individual with the condition, their family and carers who look after this. I can read this. And wider society. So currently, it's in 2019, it was thought to cost 42 billion in the UK and 1.3 trillion worldwide. So if we can prevent dementia a bit, we will improve individuals' lives, we will improve their families' life, and we will have a dementia bonus in the economy. So it's vastly, vastly important. So why should you consider it preventable? In the last 20 years, in some high-income countries, in the United States and Europe, there has been a 25% decrease in the incidence, in the age-related incidence. So there's more dementia because there are more older people. But if we look at any age group, there's a 25% decrease in the incidence. So if we had any drugs like that, they'd be on the front page of the papers every day. We don't have any drugs like that. Nonetheless, it's been stable or increased in some countries, including, and I don't necessarily understand why, Japan, but in East Asian countries, South American countries, and South Asian countries. So dementia is potentially not inevitably preventable. It depends what we do as to whether we can make a difference. And the mechanisms of this prevention is thought to be two things: cognitive reserve or resilience, and I'll talk to you in a minute what that means. And the other thing is a reduction in damage. And the improvements in these high-income countries have mainly been in more educated people, and in men more than women. So if you, there's still, even in the highest income countries, a huge possibility of decreasing further. So this is what cognitive reserve is. These are graphs of postmortems of people and the neuropathology. So if you look at the one on the bottom left, people on average who have high cognitive performance when they die have considerably less neuropathology than people who have severe dementia. That's what you'd expect. But if you look at the individuals, there are people on the top left with high cognitive performance who have more neuropathology than people with late dementia. So some people are able to resist the neuropathology and not develop dementia. And that's what we call cognitive reserve. And that's what we're all hoping that we will develop. So within the Lancet Commission on Dementia, there's been 3 of them, 2017, 2020, 2024. We all come into a room and I ask people before to come and present about various putative risk factors, and our aim is to decide on which risk factors have enough to include. And the decisions are sort of epidemiological decisions. We look at high quality, consistent evidence. It precedes dementia. If you change it, it makes a difference. And there's consistent dose respondent validly measured. And we look at existing evidence. We do searches. We do systematic reviews. And I have a list there. I'm not expecting you to compute it because I'm going to talk about most of them, about things which make a difference in dementia. And we take a life course view of it. We think about when in the life course it makes a difference. And then we think about the population attributable fraction. And that's a population which is the percentage which is theoretically preventable. Now, people are just not like rats or mice. Things cluster within them. And the person who doesn't take exercise is more likely to be obese, more likely to be hypertensive, more likely to have diabetes. And therefore, we have to take into account that people often have several risk factors. And if you just look at one and say everybody who has this is more likely to develop dementia, you're going to come to the wrong answer. So we use this and we adjust for communality with these 14 risk factors. And I can and have published exactly both the formula and the computer code, but I'm not going to bore you with that this second. And just to give you some idea, if you look at this, these are all of them, then you come to the weighted and unweighted paths per population attributable fraction. So if you don't weight them according to people having them clustering together, they come up at a much higher number, usually about 3 times. So it really makes a very big difference. So we put all 14 together and we came out with this infographic where we look at the different stages of life when it matters, and putting all 14 together, then 45% of dementias are theoretically preventable with if we could remove all of these risk factors. Now, what's really unusual about this conference for me is that usually the people before show our diagram and our infographic, but I'm guessing that most people in this room have never seen that. Has anyone ever seen this before? Put your hand up if you've seen it. A few people. Okay, so it's a real minority new bit of information. So I'm going to go through them, and I'm going to take a life course event, and I'm going to go through them fast because we don't have much time. I can say lots and lots and lots more, but I'm not going to. I just want to talk about education. We think that education increases your cognitive reserve, and great news, globally education has increased, but it's still low in some countries. And in particular, interestingly, in the States, in the last sort of 10, 15, in the last 20 years, really, the minority ethnic education has increased. And with that, the amount of dementia, which is much more than the white, has decreased. But what's very interesting is my colleague, Mika Kivamaki, who's here we're not in UCL, but in UCL with me, led this paper, which I was part of, where for the first time he was able to disaggregate education and employment, because obviously people with more education are more likely to have greater employment. And he was able to find a large number of people who had highly cognitively stimulating jobs without very much education. So if we look at people who have neither education past about age 12 or a cognitively stimulating job, and if we compare them, people who don't have the education but have a cognitively stimulating job have only 80% of the chance of getting dementia. People who have the education have 70%, and people who have both, which I'm guessing is most of the people in this room, have about a 60% chance of developing dementia. And that means that cognitive stimulation throughout life makes a difference. It's independent. And I'm not talking about doing the odd Sudoku. This is sort of daily cognitive stimulation and doing a variety of different things. Now, the thing that we were surprised about, and I'm no longer surprised because it doesn't last all that long, was that hearing loss was the greatest risk, hearing loss in midlife. And since we talked about that in 2017, there's been more and more studies of people with hearing loss at baseline compared to those without hearing loss. And a new meta-analysis continues to find a dose-related risk. So the more hearing loss you have, the more difference it makes. And using hearing aids is protective. Now, obviously, people who use hearing aids are not the same as the people who don't use hearing aids. And it might be measuring higher socioeconomic class. It might be measuring people who are better at coping with problems and coming to solutions as well. There's been one randomized controlled trial, also from the States, from Franklin, and it was extremely interesting. So he got the people in doing two things. One of them he advertised, and one of them he had a cohort which already exists. And the people who had the people who were advertised for, the hearing aids didn't make any difference. And that was because none of them deteriorated. And these were people who were extremely well and extremely cognitively intact. But from the long-term cohort where they were older, there were more unwell people, made a massive difference, the randomized controlled trial, and in fact was more protective than one would have expected, possibly because people who hear then begin to do other things like socialize, get less depressed, do lots of other things. So hearing seems to be very important. I'm just going to begin to whiz through some of the others. So cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, it's very common. In high income countries, about 3/4 of people by the end of midlife have high cholesterol. And there's the risk is, and people who are treated in midlife for this have a decreased risk of dementia. So having it increases your risk, treating it with statins decreases your risk of dementia. So there's a clear opportunity to prevent dementia. Midlife depression increases the risk for dementia. We did a new meta-analysis for this commission. For the first time, we were able to look at midlife depression because we know that as people develop dementia, their brains are more vulnerable and they're more likely to get depressed. And what we found is a much higher risk a very interesting UK biobank study found that people who were treated with antidepressants or psychotherapy or both, or remitted spontaneously, lost nearly all of their excess risk of depression. So treating and helping depression is important for individuals' quality of life at the time in midlife and for their future risk of dementia. Hypertension, high blood pressure has been known for a very long time to be a problem. What happens if you do a randomized controlled trial of antihypertensive is that you have to stop it because the people in the non-intervention group do so much worse that it's not ethical to go on. So the only way of finding out is by doing meta-analysis, because they never reach their time. They never reach their number that they're trying to, because it makes such a big difference in terms of stroke and heart attack. And longer term meta-analysis finds that being treated for hypertension decreases the risk of cognitive deterioration and of dementia. Traumatic brain injury in sport. I think that I can barely open anything in the media without hearing about people who have been playing rugby or football and have had dementia, and they attribute it to. I know it's sort of salient because it interests me. Anyway, there is really quite a lot of evidence that that is the case. That people who play in roles where they're more likely to head a ball are more likely to get dementia. I'm really pleased that partly I think as a result, or a lot as a result of our work and other people who've continued to work, they've now stopped children in primary school in Britain heading balls. And I'm now talking with the World Rugby Federation, and they are trying to do two things. They're trying to prevent head injury in younger ones. And for older people who've already had the head injury during their career, they're trying to work with them to increase their cognitive reserve and say, there are other risk factors and you can make a difference. And it's fabulously gratifying to think that lots of people may be helped by this work. Physical inactivity, exercise and fitness. I think it's important to know that the reduction in risk is greatest when you go from being completely lacking in energy to doing a bit. Okay, so you don't need to do ultra marathons. We're not asking that, but it's probably a good idea to do some exercise. I know many of my colleagues are wearing their Fitbits, and they have to, and it is important. Exercise, do whatever you like, because then you're more likely to do it, but keep exercising. There's little benefit in randomized controlled trials, but that's probably because they only last 1 or 2 years. And probably exercise needs to be of longer duration and preferably starting in midlife. Diabetes, there's new evidence that shows that midlife diabetes is a particular risk, and that using, and this is another thing I see in the news all the time, these new drugs which people are talking about from obesity, but the randomized controlled trials of them in diabetes show a decrease in people developing dementia to about 50%. Hugely important. We don't know what happens to people with obesity without diabetes. So there's an increased risk of dementia, particularly in midlife obesity. As you're developing dementia, then you lose weight. And therefore, if you look at late life, there isn't the same risk. Unintentional weight loss is associated with cognitive improvement. Social isolation, there's further evidence that less frequent social engagement is associated with dementia. There's a lack of studies about increasing social engagement. It's quite difficult to do. Alcohol, drinking more than 21 units a week, UK units, so they're 14 for my American colleagues over there, there's 14 US units a week, is associated with increased risk of dementia. That's not that much. You can have 2 glasses of wine every night, particularly since people's glasses at home tend to get bigger, and go well over it. Never see yourself as having an alcohol problem and never be drunk. So it's not that much. So it's important to try and watch it. That's 21 compared to having 7 to 14. There is also a risk in people who don't drink. I think that that's probably not true, that actually a lot of people who don't drink are probably people who've given up drinking. There is a higher death from liver disease in abstinent people. I think it's probably not true, but tonight when I go home, I will choose to believe that it's protective. There's evidence that reducing alcohol to a moderate risk over 2 years later, people have lost their excess risk. So it makes a really big difference. Similarly with smoking, all doctors, including me, say that smoking is bad for you. I particularly worry about it being bad for you getting dementia. But again, both Britain and Korea have shown that people who give up smoking lose that excess risk 2 years later. So there's really quite a lot that can be done. Similarly, changing air pollution, studies in China, in France and in America have found that decreasing air pollution decreases cognitive loss and dementia. Visual loss, pretty similar. It's common, it's often untreated, particularly in low and middle income countries, and treating it, correcting vision, makes a big difference. So overall, what am I telling you? I'm telling you there are lots of risk factors, and changing them, we have really good evidence that changing them makes a difference. And that changing them probably initially increases quality of life and then long-term decreases dementia. Randomized controlled trials of multi-domain interventions have worked, but not as well as you'd think. And that's because they tend, we think, to recruit low-risk people. And the older ones did the same things for everyone. So I was invited out to dinner one Saturday, and this family said to me, why are they running? It was a pediatrician married to a GP, and say, we've been recruited. He has mild cognitive impairment. They're telling us to eat well and to exercise more. He's always exercised and he eats well. Why are they doing this? So the more recently personalized ones have found a much where they treat the risk factors you have, not the risk factors you don't have found a much bigger effect size. These are individual, but it's not just about individual intervention. Culture, poverty and inequality make all the difference. If I can't go out in the street and exercise and walk because it's unsafe for women, I'm pretty likely to be immobile. So those who are deprived need the changes most. They'll derive the highest benefit, and it differs within and between countries. So these figures that I've shown you have looked at figures throughout the world. And we need to think beyond promoting individual health and improve the circumstances in which people live. So we did this study in Australia. And what do you think? This is in Lancet Public Health in 2023. First Nation people had many more of these risk factors than European. And European had slightly more than people of East Asian descent. It makes a difference as to your culture and your socioeconomic circumstances. Lower and middle income countries have higher numbers. So think about not just the whole population, but individuals and individual groups. We did some work looking at cost and cost effectiveness. You have to do this in a particular country because costs vary between country. And we found that if we intervened if there was a sort of hearing aid clinic in every country, in every corner, and people, and similarly with antihypertensive and smoking cessation, looking at trials as to how well these work, that we would be an 8.5% reduction in dementia prevalence and a 2.4 billion per year saving in health, social and unpaid care. Diabetes by itself, economically at that point, and things may have changed, was not worth it. We also modelled cost saving from public interventions in England and found that if you change the formulation of food to decrease salt, so people didn't need to change anything, they bought what looked like the same food to them but was different, that would decrease blood pressure and save 2.4 billion for dementia alone. Similarly, with sugar, it would save 1 billion. And various other public health things would make less of an economic, but would make a difference for individuals and for people developing dementia. So what does it mean? Overall, there's new and very hopeful evidence about dementia prevention. Individuals and governments can do more, and governments should do more, because what are governments for if it's not to try and try and prevent the diseases which worry people most? Almost half of dementias are worldwide potentially preventable. There will be more, but the evidence is unclear. There's much more evidence now that individual interventions make a difference, and the potential for risk reduction at scale through policy change. Unlike what we generally talk about in medicine or in public health, it looks like this would save money. But also the most important thing is to help individuals avoid dementia. Many would never develop it. Those people who do develop it would tend to develop it at an older age and live less long with it. So gifting fewer years of illness, which is what people dread, and more healthy years. So my message to all of you is to be ambitious about prevention. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have about 10-12 minutes for questions. If you have any questions, wow.
Is there any correlation with people who've been in abusive relationships, so physical and mental abuse?
It's a very interesting question. And the last time I talked about this was about 2 weeks ago to a women's health group. And they said, and what about domestic abuse? I think the thing about abuse is that it tends to be hidden. And we don't know who's been abused and what's happening. I think it's extremely likely that both of these things make a difference, but it is really, really hard to know who has been abused, and people who have been abused are frequently much less able to speak out than the rest, or are being abused than the rest of the population.
You mentioned about a development of the influence of the development of dementia with people with midlife diabetes occurring. Do you have any data about childhood diabetes?
Sorry, about what?
Childhood diabetes.
No, I don't know.
Thank you. I wanted to know if we know how the COVID pandemic could potentially affect the incidence of cognitive impairment and development of dementia. I'm a clinician from Montreal, Quebec, and I've witnessed patients developing neurocognitive decline after the pandemic because of the anxiety level, isolation, and so on. I don't know if my question is clear. I'm more fluent in French, sorry.
I think you tell me if I've got this right. I think you're saying, did the pandemic make a difference?
Yes, exactly.
I think that it's very difficult to know because there are different things. One of the things that happened to old people and people with cognitive impairment during the pandemic is they died. They died disproportionately for a variety of reasons. And therefore, some of the people who would have developed dementia didn't because they were dead. and that's very sad. We would think that the risk factors increased during the pandemic in terms of social isolation, but also in terms of that you have a virus which can affect your brain. I think that so many things happened at that time that it's extremely difficult for us to know the answer. But there's some very interesting findings about viruses now. So we have a list in the Commission of risk factors which we think might be important, but we don't think there's enough evidence yet. And I think there's more and more evidence about infection and severe infection. And in particular, if we look at inoculation, so there's some really very interesting data which seems to suggest that inoculations which prevent people getting infections make them less likely to develop cognitive impairment and dementia.
Well, you kind of answered my question before I asked it. The number of risk factors on your list has actually increased between reviews. So do you expect that list to grow longer? Do you have any kind of candidate risk or protective factors that you would like to see on the list? There's a list
within the Commission of various ones. I do expect it to grow longer. And I'm really, really rubbish at knowing which ones will there be more at it. So with each one, I think this will be the next ones. And then science isn't really like that. It grows in spurts and things. So I have things in my mind as to what I think are likely to be the next ones. I'll probably be wrong, but there's already a list of a variety of ones which we considered. We didn't think they were not risk factors. We just didn't think there was enough evidence to say they were risk factors. So you can look at that list and see them. So I'm sure that there are others. I'm completely sure that there are others, and that the list will grow. And I think, as an aside, it's not terribly surprising that the drugs which clear amyloid don't cure dementia when we think that actually cognitive reserve is a really important part of it.
Thank you, Gill, for all your information. I'm Marie-Claude. I'm also from Montreal. Wherever I go in the world, I go visit retirement residences just to see. I'm really focused on the language that we use when seniors move into retirement residences. I'm actually going to visit one down the road that is teaching deaf seniors sign language. There's a documentary that was out. So I was just wondering, I was quite surprised that the deafness has a huge role in dementia. Part of the study, was it also deafness from birth that affects, or is it comprehension and communication that can help us break that cycle of dementia?
It's acquired deafness. So people who, you probably know this lots better than me, but I don't know, that people who are deaf from birth communicate, and there is a deaf community. And this does not seem to be the same at all. So we don't think it's the deafness per se. And if it were, then hearing aids wouldn't make any difference if we thought it was like a nerve damage or whatever that was doing it, and hearing aids do. So we think it's lack of ability to hear. And what do you do when you can't hear? You isolate because it's embarrassing. People don't speak to you so much because you don't respond, and they often think you're cognitively impaired well before you are. And so you stop doing lots of things that are good for your health and sit alone. So that's what we think.
Hello. My question is, what's the risk in individuals with autism spectrum disorder or any other cognitive conditions to get dementia?
Isn't it autism spectrum disorder, if that's what you call it, and people call it all different things, very interesting, because when I was training as a psychiatrist, because that's my job, hardly anyone had autism, and it was a very severe illness which people had almost no language, and now we think about autism in a much broader way. So what I'm trying to say is that the very long-term follow-up studies of people my age and older who had autism or autism spectrum disorder don't exist because they didn't have a diagnosis at that time. If we look at schizophrenia, people with schizophrenia are more likely, it's not the same, but it's also a cognitive disorder with your brain, are more likely to develop dementia. And in fact, when they develop schizophrenia at young age, they have a cognitive impairment even then. What we don't know is whether that's separate from the fact that people with schizophrenia tend to, not all of them, some people get really well, but they tend to neglect themselves. They tend to smoke very hard. They tend to have high blood pressure, often not treated. They tend to obesity, often related to the drugs. And we don't know. So it's one of the things that's down as, is it schizophrenia per se, or is it the lifestyle of things related to schizophrenia? I know you didn't ask about it, but you asked about other sort of brain disorders.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was quite informative. We discussed about different aspects that can, like cause dementia, like physical inactivity, smoking, alcohol. I want to ask about data related to inheritance or having dementia in the hereditary.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to such kind of individuals? They might have a very healthy life, but I want to just understand the percentage of it might affect despite of them being healthy or
Sure.
having all sorts of things.
Okay. So between 1% and 2% of the people who develop Alzheimer's disease have an autosomal dominant gene and are inevitably going to develop dementia if they live that long. The evidence is that looking at these other risk factors, that they still develop dementia, but they develop it slightly later. So it can help, but it certainly doesn't cure. In late life, the gene ApoE4 makes people much more likely to develop dementia than those people who have other things. And it's similar evidence that people who have this gene can live longer dementia or have both two copies of the gene because it's recessive, can live, or has less effect in one, live a longer dementia-free life. So it makes a difference even if you have a gene, but the gene interacts. It's not one or the other.
Thank you this is a very fascinating presentation, and it's a very contentious area of research. On the American end, we focus mostly on ADRD, and the science is very clear that if you can reverse or prevent dementia, it's not dementia. Dementia is irreversible. It's a chemical process. The only true risk factor we have is your family history. And again, this is contentious. This is where the fun comes in, the arguments. But it's good to focus on these chronic health conditions like hearing loss, like depression, like high blood pressures, but those are comorbidities. It's really not. If we can treat it, WHO used to call it acute dementia back in the 80s. We don't do that anymore. But it's sort of lumping. That's why we have about 400 different kinds of dementia now. We can't cure anything. We can't treat anything. But if we can help control chronic health disease, that's great. Otherwise, we're about where we were. And quite frankly, the scientific community is so fed up with amyloid theory that they're about ready to scream. And I've been around long enough to watch EPOA come in and out of fashion like jorts. So I'm fascinated by this ongoing debate, but we have to be very clear about terms. And ADRD which is where I work. I don't care about dementia. Dementia is just a grab bag term. You can't treat it. It's irreversible. It's brain damage. It is an absorbing state that eventually destroys and kills the individual. But it's good we're isolating all these other factors that cause people to have issues that can be treated that affect their cognitive abilities. And so this was good. This was a nice summary of the dementia argument. And thank you very much for putting it together like that. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for appreciating it. And you're not the only one who's appreciating it. It's dramatically quoted, and it's it's got its way into American policy. And they asked me as part of that, which is amazing because I was the only non-American, because Americans find it very difficult to think that anyone else knows anything. However, I'd like to say I too have been around since the 80s or working in this. So first of all, most people who develop dementia are old, and people who develop dementia when they're aged over 80 usually have multiple pathology, and each bit of the pathology then contributes. And I'm a dementia clinician, I've seen thousands, tens of thousands of people with dementia. It's what I do as a doctor. People with dementia get worse. I'm not talking about people with dementia. I'm talking about people who don't have dementia and trying to prevent them developing it. That's completely different. I agree that many people within the dementia community have felt very skeptical. And when we wrote the first Lancet commission, I got huge amounts of hate mail. But now the biggest dementia conference in the world is the AAIC. I'm keynoting at it, talking about my things. I think they've stopped arguing with me all the time. You can keep arguing. It's people who have a vaccination, this is not a vaccination, don't get the illness. We don't then say, well, vaccinations don't work. I absolutely agree that people who tell me that they have dementia and they've cured themselves, I don't believe them. But I completely think that you can prevent or delay dementia. And we have evidence that that is the case. I'm not making up this evidence. We have huge amounts of evidence that what we do matters. So I think I'm going to keep trying.